This Old Pinball video podcast on game room equipment,
including recent pinball machines, classic driving games, baseball games, skee-ball machines,
prepare for battle,
classic gun games, classic pinball machines, bowling machines, hockey games, and coin-operated video games. Today's episode, the evolution of the pinball machine. Topcast host is Shaggy of This Old Pinball's DVD videos.
In this video podcast, we hope to offer entry-level information on the variety of game room equipment to outfit your basement to make it your home game room of your dreams. Now, there's a lot of information to cover, and we hope to have a good series of these podcasts to explain this equipment and what you need to know when you're purchasing game room equipment. We're not going to cover in depth things that we normally cover in the This Old Pinball series of repair and restoration videos that's available at marvin3m.com/TOP. This is much more rudimentary and entry level to kind of gain an interest and draw people more into the home game room hobby. Coin-operated equipment. Now that's an interesting term, coin-operated. And you'll hear it abbreviated coin-op by many of the vendors and salespeople relating to pinball and other arcade equipment. Basically, anything that takes a coin to operate means it's a coin-op or arcade piece. And you'll find that a lot of people are really enamored with this style of equipment because of a large nostalgia background that a lot of people have where they went to arcades in their youth and they remember playing these games. One question I get asked a lot at Topcast is, what game should I buy? What is a good pinball game for me? I can't really answer that for you. I can't tell you what game is good or bad. Anybody that tells you a game is bad, don't listen to them. A game is good if you like it. A game is bad if you don't like it. That's the single scenario that you need to worry about in determining whether a game is good or bad. If it's fun for you, if it holds your attention, and if you like it.
When buying a game, a lot of people operate in a nostalgia mode, and they want a particular game that they remember playing when they were a kid. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, but I am saying perceptions change with time, and the way you remember a game from childhood may not hold water today. And that's the reason why we're going through this exercise of pin game history to help align your memories of yesterday with your perceptions of today. So it's best to play before you pay. Also keep in mind that an old game may be in bad playing condition, and this can alter your views. But the good news is, most any game can be reconditioned to play like new.
In this episode, I'd like to show you the evolution of the pinball game, from the 1950s wood rail up to current solid-state technology. Now we're going to explain a bunch of terminology that's used to describe these games, something that you should know, especially if you're new to the hobby and you don't really know all the terms and terminologies and the eras of games and features that came out and when they appeared in the pinball evolutionary timeline. Let's talk about some terminology on these games, and the first thing we need to talk about is EM, or electromechanical. That's what any game is that doesn't have a computer in it. That is, it does not use any silicone to control the game. Those games are all called electromechanical. Anything 1977 and before is basically going to be an electromechanical game. And that's going to have the chimes and the bells and the clicking of the relays. And you're going to hear that term a lot, EM, meaning electromechanical. The first game in the pinball evolution that I'd like to describe is what's known as a wood rail game. And it's called a wood rail because the rails on the side of the game are made of wood, usually maple or oak. They used this style of game from 1930s up to about 1960 when they went over to metal rails, where the side of the cabinets are made out of stainless steel. But let's talk about the wood rail first. I'm going to be addressing post-World War II or post-war games, and specifically 1947 and later, because in 1947, that's when the flipper was invented. The flipper being the bat that the player controls by the cabinet buttons on the side of the game that kick the ball up and make it much more interesting to play. Games prior to 1947 did not have any really player control other than what's known as shaking and nudging the game, where the player would actually shake and nudge the game to give it English to try and manipulate where the ball went into what hole or what scoring points. Prior to flippers, pin games were largely considered gambling devices because there really wasn't any skill involved. With the advent of flippers, that changed everything. All of a sudden, the game had a skill factor, a big skill factor, as you can see from good pinball players, where they can make any shot on the field using good flipper control and lots of practice. So that's why the game evolved from being more of a gambling device prior to 1947 to a skill device 1947 and later. But anyways, back to the wood rail thing. A lot of people like wood rails because they have a very classic look. Early wood rails will have wooden legs. By about 1956, wood legs changed to metal legs. Likewise, earlier wood rails will have wooden up here and wooden up here. By 56, they were cheapening the games a bit and using a lot of metal parts because metal was costing less than wood. Also, the scoring on wood rails is very interesting. Instead of having reels with numbers on it, it's what's known as light box scoring. That is, it lights up 1 million points, 200,000, and 10 points on this particular game at this particular point in time. That's called light box scoring. That didn't evolve to score reels until about 1956 again, when multiplayer games came out, and some other games also had score reels as early as 54, but basically until 1960, you're going to mostly see on wood rails this light box scoring. Another thing that's very interesting on wood rails is this is a single player game. That is, only one player can play at a time. This is a 5-ball game, so that means one player goes up, starts their game, plays 5 balls. If another player wants to play, the first player has to complete his game before the second player can start. That's the attributes of a single player game. In 1956, again, you can see 56 was really an evolutionary year in pinball. They came up with something called multiplayer games. The first 4-player game came out. Again, used, instead of light box scoring, used score reels because you had to have room on the back box to score for 4 players. And then you would go alternate, where one player would go up, shoot his first ball, the second player would go up, shoot his first ball, all the way through the 5 balls. That's what's known as a multiplayer game. Now, generally speaking, multiplayer games from this era, from the 50s and 60s that is, are less challenging than single-player games because the mechanisms inside required to deal with multiple players made them have to compact the game in features so that multiplayer games from the 50s and 60s generally don't have as many fun play features as a single-player game will have. So you see a lot of people look for single-player games. At first glance, it may appear that single-player games are not as good as multiplayer games, but to someone like me personally, I much rather have a single-player game than a multiplayer game, almost in all cases. The next style of game in the pinball evolution came about in about 1960, and that's what's known as a metal rail game. Again, the rails along the side of the game are made of metal, hence a metal rail. This particular game is by Gottlieb and is known as a wedge head. You'll hear that terminology a lot when people talk about single-player Gottlieb games. And it's called a wedge head because the back box, which is this unit up here, is shaped like a wedge. That is, it's wider on top than it is towards the bottom. All wedge head games are single-player games. Just keep that in mind. Also by 1960, all games were using score reels for their scoring. Light box scoring was no longer used. Everything was basically using score reels, whether it be single player or multiplayer. Another thing that happened in the late 60s was a change from 2-inch flippers, like I've seen here, to the longer 3-inch flippers, which greatly changed the dynamics of the gameplay. We're going to take a little break from all this, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Hi there, it's Bob from Bob Inc. And if you want to get some NetherRealm games in your collection and you're looking for something a little different, we've got a product for you. What's coming out, Bob?
Well, Bob, you take this game kit, move it into these customized 2x4s that we customize to fit your game. And then you just take some ordinary hand tools and you attach them to your game. And this is giving you a wood rail game. It's an amazing product you need to have.
Well, as you can see here, this thing is really easy to install in this here game, and you can get it at any pinball retailer all over the United States here. This is made in the USA, not freaking Australia. Where else you can get it there, Bob?
You can get it at bobandbobinc.com, right there on your page, right there.
Amazing quality! Thanks, Bob and Bob! Let's get back to the information, my man. Here's a multiplayer game. That is, up to 4 people can play at one time. And I can see that because on the back glass, which is this glass with the graphics on it, this is known as the score glass or back glass. I have up to 4 players worth of score reels that can be seen. Player 1, Player 2, Player 3, and Player 4. Now, they came out with multiplayer games starting in 1956, but by the late 60s they became very, very prevalent because they were more of a moneymaker for the manufacturers. That is, they could charge more for a 4-player game than they could charge for a single-player game. So sales of multiplayer games really skyrocketed in the late 60s and through the 70s. Now, these games are still electromechanical, and these games are very, very readily available because they made a boatload of them during the 1970s. Here's the inside of a typical electromechanical game. You can see motorized scoring device here, mechanical stepping units here, relays all lined up here, transformer up here, chime boxes to make the traditional electromechanical sounds. Next in the pin game evolution, what's known as solid-state games. That is, instead of using electromechanical devices, score reels, and stepper units, and motors to control the game, you now have a computer that lies behind this back glass. So this game from 1978 is a Williams Phoenix, and it actually has a computer back here, a very early computer, but it's still a computer not unlike what you're using to watch this video right now. With the advent of computers, all solid-state games are basically 4-player games. There are some exceptions, but 99.9% of the games are going to be 4-player games because now there's memory to remember, for instance, how many targets a particular player scored, how many drop targets they hit, how high they got in the bonus. The computer can remember all that stuff. Back in the electromechanical era, you couldn't remember those things. That's why every ball, every player, the game would reset all the game features because there was no way for the game to remember how many targets you had hit, how far you had advanced into the rule sets. So with the advent of solid-state computers, and the game can remember where each player has progressed through the game, that was the big feature behind solid-state games and why a lot of people like them. Because all of a sudden the rules got a lot deeper, that is, more complicated, with more things to do and achieve and accomplish, and yet it still was a 4-player game, meaning that you could have head-to-head competition. So a lot of people like solid-state games because of that. Early solid-state games used what's known as numeric displays. That is, these have no capability to display text unless they can make it out of the segments used on each one of these numbers for the display. This particular game is also 6 digits, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Later games will actually move to 7 digits so that you can score over 1,000,000 points. Another important feature of most solid-state games is solid-state sound. That is, when you start a game, you get some sort of sound, and while you play the game, you get sound too. Now, because this is an early game, there's no background sound. That's kind of unusual, and by the late 70s, most games are playing music in the background, even when the ball is not scoring on any targets. Also, by about 1979, you'll see games starting to talk. They won't have a lot of vocabulary, and it may not be easy to understand, but they will talk. By 1986, just about all games talk, and the speech is considerably better, much more clear, and with a greater vocabulary. The solid-state computer in the back box of this 1978 Williams Phoenix. This kind of gives you an idea of what lives back there and controls this game is in fact a computer. Starting about 1986, solid-state games advanced to having alphanumeric score displays. That is, the displays had more segments per each digit, meaning that they could easily display not only numbers, but text too. So on this particular game, Earthshakers by Williams, 1989, you can see that I have high score initials and also words going across the screen describing features of the game. The games also became much more advanced. Of course, this is a progression of events, and as time goes on, things tend to get more complicated because the rules are deeper and there's more to do, more playfield toys, more ramps, and other devices and wire forms on the playfield. The companies really got into using plastic ramps to move the ball around at different levels within the game, and also wire forms to bring the ball back to the player, again, at different levels in the game. You'll start to see that more by the mid-'80s and used extensively once we hit the '90s. The last and current style of solid-state pinball game came about around 1991 with the advent of what's known as a dot matrix score display. Instead of having individual scores for each player that were either numeric or alphanumeric, you now had a score display which could actually draw graphics, pictures, and actually miniature little movies on the screen. So they could use any font they wanted and animate basically anything they wanted on the screen. Again, this came around 1991, 1992, and is the style of game that is used today. Again, solid state with their computer back behind the score glass, running all this stuff with the dot matrix display. Now we're going to talk about some general pinball terminology, things you need to know in order to talk intelligently about a game. The first question that I always get asked by people that actually own games or are buying games is, how do you get the glass off? Well, first, the glass here is called the top glass, okay? The glass back there with the graphics on it is called the score glass or the back glass. Getting the top glass off is usually very simple. The first thing you have to do is find the coin door. The coin door is this, in this case, metal door right here that the coins go through when you play a game on location. Hopefully, it's unlocked. There is no such thing as a master key, okay? If this is locked and you don't have a key, you have but two choices. A, pry it open with a big-ass screwdriver, or B, drill the lock. Neither of those things I'm going to show you right now. I'm assuming you can get the coin door open, and then there is a bar right here that releases the metal lockdown bar. This bar across the front of the game that locks down the top glass is called the lockdown bar. So this lever pushes it, and it releases this bar that comes off like this. Once the bar is released, magically, the glass slides right out! Look at that! Isn't it amazing? Glass! It's out of the game. Boy, you would see the people that struggle to get top glass off, and it's really that easy. On the issue of top glass, I need to mention that there are a couple different kinds of top glass. You always want tempered glass, not safety glass, tempered glass in your game. So how do you tell if you have tempered glass? Well, first thing, if the glass is cracked, it's not tempered glass, okay? Because when tempered glass breaks, it breaks into a million of these little chiclets. I mean, tiny, tiny little things. It just explodes. Plate glass is what you use in windows, and that stuff will just crack into large shards, and you can really, really get hurt. I've been unbelievably cut by plate glass. I've been maybe minorly cut at most by tempered glass. Now, why tempered glass? Tempered glass has 8 times the strength of plate glass. That means if I take a hammer and hit it, tempered glass will not break. Well, usually won't break. It'll withstand up to 8 times the amount of abuse, like I just showed, that plate glass. Plate glass, this would have been cracked in 2. Now, the one disadvantage to tempered glass is the edges. That is, along the edge. Now, normally on a pinball machine, that's going to be covered by the side rails and the lockdown bar. But if you take a hammer and hit tempered glass on the side, it takes barely anything to break this into a million little chiclets. Now that's important to know because when you pull a top glass out and you set it down hard on the ground, like a hard concrete floor, that's where you're going to break this stuff. A lot of tempered glass has little logos in the corner that says it's tempered. Not all, but a lot of it does. Now once you got the playfield glass out, say you want to lift the playfield up to service the game underneath, I always take the ball out, so I reach my finger in here and kick it to the shooter lane and take the ball out. Then I just grab the playfield right here by the ball arch and lift straight up. And you have complete access to the bottom of the game. And there's also a nice little prop rod, usually on the inside of the game, so that you can prop the playfield up. This part of the game is called the back box. In the back box you have the back glass or score glass, and on this particular game you have the score displays, with this display right here being the ball credit match display. This part of the pinball cabinet is called the lower cabinet, and this houses the playing field and the coin door and the top glass. A lot of games, both old and new, will have keys inside the coin door which unlock the back box so you can get into either to the computer boards or into the back door on an electromechanical game. Inside the cabinet there's the all-important tilt mechanism, which is a little pendulum, and when the game is tilted too hard, the pendulum shorts out to the surrounding metal bracket. Also on this game there's a ball roll. You don't see that on any of the newer games. In case you're wondering how many balls to install in the game, newer games will have a little sticker that actually tells you how many balls to install. Older games, it's not so obvious. Most games use one ball, but some older EMs, especially with the manual ball lift, can use up to 5 balls. This is the shooter rod. That is this device right here that propels the ball into play. On the front of the cabinet, right here, there's a start button that I press to start the game, assuming that the game has credits. Note, some games do not have what's known as a free play option. That is, they don't have any way to add credits to the game without you putting money through it. So a lot of times you'll see a modification like this, where somebody's added a switch that'll add credits to the game. Once there's credits on the game, you can press the start button to start a game. Once I have the game started, the ball will shoot into the shooter lane, and I will pull back the shooter rod to launch the ball into play. On the side of the cabinet, there are the flipper buttons. These are player controllable buttons which control the flippers. This entire wood plank that the ball rolls on is known as the playfield, or the playing surface. It is silk screened with graphics. These are not decals on here, but this is actually silk screened ink, and then it is clear coated with usually a lacquer or maybe an automotive clear coat, something along that nature, to protect it so that it does not wear easily. These little plastic lighted inserts in the playing field are called lamp inserts, and these have a light bulb underneath them that will light up as you progress through the game. These 3 devices are called either jet bumpers, thumper bumpers, mushroom bumpers. Those are all valid names for these things. I call them pop bumpers, and their whole purpose is to kick the ball. Down here, of course, you have the flippers, and the flippers, of course, are controlled by the cabinet switches on the side of the cabinet, and this is what kicks the ball up. These devices here are called the slingshot kickers. Sometimes people call them triangle kickers because they're shaped like a triangle. If I put the ball on there, they kick the ball, like such. This game has something on the side here called drop targets. That is, when the ball hits them, the targets drop out of the way. And when they all go down, they generally all come up. This game also has something that's called stand-up targets. That's this target right here that just stands up and it doesn't retract unlike, say, a drop target. A very popular feature on a lot of games is the spinner. That is, when the ball goes by here, it spins the target around, giving points. This device right here is called a kick-out hole because when the ball rolls into it, it kicks it out. This style of switch right here is called a rollover switch because the ball rolls over it. This style of switch is called a roll-under switch because as the ball hits the switch, it rolls under it. Outside the triangle kicker, on most games, you have what's known as an in lane, which returns the ball to the flipper, and an out lane, which returns the ball outside the flipper and drains it down to the out hole. The out hole is the hole right here where the ball drains, scores your bonus, and then kicks the ball to the shooter lane. This is called the out hole. This device here is called a wire form or a habit trail. This device here is called a clear plastic ramp. It gives the game a multi-layer effect. This device here is called a vertical up kicker because when the ball goes into it, it kicks the ball straight up, that is vertically. This metal apron right here is often called the lower ball arch or lower ball apron. It houses the scorecard. This game also has an upper ball arch, and that's this plastic up here. Sometimes they're metal, sometimes they're plastic like that, sometimes they're not even there on the game. Depends what era of the game. Notice that these triangle kickers or slingshots have white rubber on them. I personally like to use white rubber on my games. I would encourage you to do the same. Black rubber is more for operators. Black rubber has a harder durometer rating, which means the rubber itself is harder, which means the game does not play as nice with black rubber compared to white rubber. Also, white rubber gives you a good indication of when your game needs to be cleaned. Nice, fresh white rubber also gives your game a nice, fresh, bright look. Something that nearly every 1968 and later pinball machine has is a power switch. I know this may be obvious to a lot of people, but you'd be surprised how many folks don't actually know that under the right-hand bottom of the cabinet, right here, there's a switch that'll turn the game on and off. Now, on pre-1968 electromechanical games, some of them don't have power switches. They don't have any sort of power switch. That is, you plug them in and you press the start button and the game lights up. But how do you turn it off? Well, you'd be surprised, but on these, especially Gottlieb games, they have something called a kickoff switch. That is, if you kick the bottom of the cabinet right about there, it sends a plunger up, which opens up a switch and turns the game off. Well, that's it for now, and I hope you come back and join us again for another episode of Topcast Video.